Welcome everybody to another developer interview here on Game Wisdom. It's the latest episode of the Perceptive podcast. My name is of course Josh Bycer, and we have another great cast lined up tonight. My guest has been working on the game Transcendence now for I believe over 5 years. I think going on possibly 7 years very
Yeah,
shortly.
even longer than that.
Ooh.
It's been quite a while.
Mm.
It's been on Steam for at least 5 years, but it was kind of
Mm-hmm.
in indie freeware before that.
Mm-hmm.
So really I started it probably 2000.
Ooh.
So it's been it's been quite a long time. I'd
Mm-hmm.
love to talk about that journey. It's pretty crazy.
Oh, yes, and that is what we're going to be doing for our episode today. So, please welcome to the cast, George. How are you doing today?
Good, thank you so much for having me. This is going to be a lot of fun for me.
Mm-hmm.
I just watched one of your episodes with Paul Ritchie and Fred Ford, who are of course the developers of Star Control 2, and it was just super interesting. I'm a big fan of them, and Transcendence is of course inspired by uh, it's a mashup of NetHack and Star Control 2. So seeing kind of the Star Control 2 designers talk about kind of how they approach some of the design, I thought was really interesting. So yeah, so I'm excited to be here with you.
It's great to have you on. Yeah, talking with Paul and Fred, that was like our second cast together. That was a really great one. I want to get them on more regularly, but they're always so busy. So it's like once every like 2 to 3 years, I seem to get a chance to talk to them.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. I'm looking forward to see what they come up with their with Urquan Masters too. That's going to be cool.
Mm-hmm. So, for our cast tonight, we're going to be talking more about Transcendence as well as developing the game. So, to get things started with, since this is your first time on, George, could you talk a little bit about who you are and what is your background in game dev?
Sure. Sure. My name is George Moromisato, an American programmer, and I started. I kind of grew up in the '80s as a traditional nerdy childhood, right? So playing Dungeons and Dragons and whatnot. But if you remember in the '80s, those of you old enough for that, back then there just weren't that many computer games, right? You kind of had to program your own games, really, if you wanted to do anything. And so that's how I started programming games. I started programming games on various mini computers. I in college I wrote a game called Anacreon. It was a DOS based galactic conquest game, a 4X game, all text mode, kind of stuff. But it was relatively popular there in the kind of in the computer lab at school. And I got into my head that, hey, this doing game things, this is pretty fun. What do I need college for? I should just start doing a game company. So I stupidly left college, started a game company, selling Anacreon. It's all like by mail type of stuff. This is way before the internet. And of course, it failed miserably. I mean, I just could not make enough money to, pay anything. So I had to get a real job. But fortunately, by then, this is again late '80s. It was so easy to get a job if you had any experience with PCs, writing software for PCs. There are a million companies all trying to build software on PCs, IBM PCs. And so it was pretty easy for me to get a job. And pretty much ever since then, I've kind of alternated between, get a real job to earn some money, and then okay, now take my savings and put it into game development because that's what I really love to do. And for the last almost 10 years now, I've just been doing game development full time with consulting work on the side to kind of keep me, um, you know, pay the mortgage, that kind of stuff. And that's just worked out incredibly well because now I really can devote my passion time to game development.
So, what kind of inspired you to start making Transcendence?
Transcendence was, as I said before, was meant to be a mashup of NetHack and Star Control 2. And NetHack was always, I'm sure you guys are all familiar with it. NetHack is this just seminal game, this roguelike that the cool thing about NetHack, in my opinion, is how the various combinations of items and the way that as a player, you can use multiple items together to get these crazy effects. I just love that kind of procedural combination that led into this, gameplay complexity. Um, I love that, and I thought, gosh, I'd love to do a space game based on that.
Mhm.
Using kind of that procedural technique, and Star Control 2 was, of course, a big game back then too, and I
Oh,
loved it.
yes.
And so, the melee mode where you just kind of fly around the spaceships is another thing that I loved. And so I kind of replicated that and thought, hey, let's just mash this up together where there's kind of it's instead of in NetHack you're a character proceeding down the dungeons. You're a spaceship and you're proceeding from star system to star system. And at each star system, you kind of run into stations, you fight monsters or enemy spaceships, whatever, upgrade your ship, all the way through. And I wanted that kind of same feeling as NetHack, where you would upgrade with different combinations of items and weapons and get different effects, get interesting effects. I don't know that I quite succeeded, honestly, because NetHack, again, I mean, it's hard to imitate NetHack. Um, but I'm really happy with kind of how the mashup ended up.
Hmm. Yeah, so I know from our chat or our DM a few days ago, you were talking about how with that original design, it didn't quite mesh with what Transcendence turned into now. So, for the
Correct.
people watching us live recorded, what's kind of the elevator pitch for what Transcendence is right now? They go to pick up on Steam.
It's so right now I would describe Transcendence as kind of an RPG where you're the spaceship instead of the character. There is a character in the game, but really it's all about upgrading your spaceship and getting your ship to be as powerful as possible, and experiencing like an RPG, like something like Skyrim. Although I mean I don't put myself on those lofty levels, but like an
Hmm.
RPG like those, so much of the fun of the game is exploring this world and interacting with, all these, crazy characters and cultures and everything. So that's now a big part of Transcendence. That's kind of morphed away from NetHack. I still have a lot of the procedural stuff, but I've added a bunch of mission arcs and other things that and a lot of that I kind of lifted from Star Control, right? Star Control kind of has this overarching story which is pretty awesome, and so I tried to kind of again blend those two things. So that's how I pitch Transcendence. Transcendence, one of the things about it is I really think of it, even though I'm just a lowly indie developer, right? I mean, I don't have a AAA budget. Um, I still have the ambitions of having a very large scale world, one where there's a lot of stuff in the game. There's a lot of encounters. The game right now, for instance, start to finish, it's about 24 hours. Like if you like really try to play it all the way to the end, even if you kind of hurry, it takes about 24 hours. There's about 24 hours of content, and so it's a pretty big world for an indie game, and that's something that I've kind of always wanted to do, and that that's I think a difference between how I'm doing it versus some other indie developers approach games in terms of a business model. A lot of indie developers will kind of do what I call the stock for portfolio version of game design, where they'll create a game every year, and it's a totally
Hmm.
different game every year. And you don't really know which game is going to be a hit, right? I mean, it's just
Hmm.
just like movies, and so you just put out a game every year, and one of those games is going to be a hit. Angry Birds, when Angry Birds came out, it was like their 40th or whatever game, and every single one before that had failed. So so you just keep on trying, keep on trying. It's just times at bat, and I'm doing something different, only because I don't think I'm creative enough to come up with a new game idea every year or
Hmm.
whatever. My approach is really much more of I've got this one game and I'm just going to make it deeper, and more interesting and richer, and have people kind of come back to it again and again and again. And that's worked out, maybe not 100% financially, but it's certainly worked out in the sense that every year players come back to it and tell me, wow, you added this. This is great. I remember playing this, 2 years ago, and now you've added this. And they come back and play the game for another, couple months, and then they come back again the next year. So that's been, I think, kind of another difference in how I've done the game.
Mm-hmm. Yep, and going back to what you said about kind of one game versus like the portfolio, like that's
Yeah.
really been, I think, one of the more like interesting like changes to like kind of like the indie dev space. I think over the last, or I guess basically over the last decade, that we've seen a lot of developers go for, as you said, like the kind of like almost like the scattered shot or shotgun approach. I'm going to make this game, and then 6 8 months I'm going to try this one. I'm going to try this one. Maybe one does well, maybe one doesn't. It's all kind of up to fate. Or for those who watch his channel, there's a lot more than fate. But
Oh yeah, for sure.
I think what we've seen now, kind of the more successful indie devs, the ones who do kind of manage to blow up, is really getting that one game, that one title that just does what it needs to. The Dead Cells, Slay the Spire, Shovel Knight, and again, we can just sit
Yeah.
here and just list big name indie games for like the next 20 minutes. And it really, I think, has kind of changed the market. I think people expect a lot more from the indie space than they did 5 10 years ago, which I think that's both good and bad. It's great because it means developers can now start charging, I think, more, a little bit more. They're starting to raise their prices, but in the same breath, I still see developers, I think, tend to struggle with, I guess, making the game look that it's worth that money. Like,
Yes.
there's a huge difference between charging $24 or $30 for a game like Disco Elysium or Slay the Spire versus say charging 99 cents,
Yep.
$3.99 for a game that it looks like something from like 20, 25 plus years ago.
Yep. Yep. Yeah, I agree. I mean, and I think that's why it's not kind of, I would say this business model is not for everybody,
Mm-hmm.
because you can't just build that kind of a game in a year. You just,
Yep.
at least not without a ton of funding. You don't have enough time to make it deep enough that you kind of get that big, huge community. A ton of examples that I've been kind of drawn to are things like Caves of Cud. Caves of Cud. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but
Oh, yes.
I mean, it's just an amazing, amazing game, and kind of another labor of love. It's just basically two developers, um, and again, kind of their modus operandi is just make that game richer and deeper, and people do come back to it every year. Um, I really think that's a great. I mean, again, these are passion projects, right? So we do whatever we wanna,
Mm-hmm.
make us feel good, and to me, that resonates with me. Working on kind of that kind of a large scale world, that resonates with me more than, okay, I'm going to come up with a new innovative design idea. Which, by the way, I think is also, I mean,
Mm-hmm.
super. You got to be super talented to do that. So to a certain extent, I'm kind of going to where my strengths are, and avoiding my weaknesses. So this
Mm-hmm.
is definitely not an either or, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And I think what we've seen from a lot of developers, it's not exactly what I would call like live service design. Like I'm working on my book on free to play and mobile games as we speak. It's more about again like that kind of just very much your. I'm not even sure. I think we use the term like long tail design to describe
Yes.
it,
Yeah.
and it's like you say, it definitely has its own pros and cons to it. And I think the one, I'm sure there's something that you can probably agree with, is that it always seems like when games start to push into multi-year, we're talking 5 10 plus years, it becomes so much harder to recoup that investment. And it is
Yes.
something that I've
Yes.
spoken to developers. I remember I spoke with what was his name? William Cheershire, the one who did A Manifold Garden. I remember I spoke
Okay.
with him, and he was like, "Yeah, we originally thought it was going to be just like a 2 year thing. Like we didn't think it was going to be that long, and then 8 to 10 years later, now the game is done." And as we've said before, like with other guests and other topics here, like the dev or the game dev or business side when it comes to game development is often, I think, one of the more harder and unfortunately one of the
Yes.
more soul crushing things to
Yeah.
discuss.
Yeah. Yeah, I do agree. I do agree. I think that's one of the hard part. And one of the problems with this kind of model of kind of just having one game is that you lose some of the marketing benefits of releasing a new game. On Steam, you put out a new game on Steam and the algorithm kind of puts you in front of people, and you kind of have instant marketing.
Mm-hmm.
I can't really do that with Transcendence. They give you kind of some, places where you can, you can kind of refresh the marketing, but it's never going to be as good as when you first ship the game. So there
Mm-hmm.
are absolutely trade-offs. One of the things that I think helps, I feel like the business model really has to be different in the sense that you now have to, it's like your community is the one supporting you rather than
Mm-hmm.
being supported by new players, who maybe have never heard of you before. It's really the way I think to make it work is to have the community that's behind you constantly re-up every year. Every year they buy the expansion. Every year they, buy the extra, whatever that you put out, because they want to be part of this, this large community. That's kind of where you have to do the trade-off.
Yeah.
You're kind of relying on the community to support you, and that means you have to design the game differently, right? I mean, you have to now
Mm-hmm.
there now you're kind of supporting the community as much of the game, which I think it's also cool. I mean, that's also kind of a fun aspect for me, um, but it's definitely different.
So with Transcendence, like I was looking at the store page before we started.
Mm.
So you can basically buy, I think, what you consider episode one right now
Yes.
of it.
Yeah.
So what is kind of the business model then? Like, what have you kind of settled on for Transcendence?
So, I can't say that this has been very successful, but my original idea was basically to put out an expansion every year. So every year put
Mm-hmm.
out an expansion that, would do like a, $6, $9, something like that. And then that would be kind of enough to keep it going. The downside or the thing that was hard for me is that I have not been able to put out an expansion every year.
Yeah.
Um, but partly just because I needed more work on the core game to just really get it to be more playable, and partly because it's a lot harder to put out expansions than I thought. But
Mm-hmm.
but now I'm starting to get to the point where I feel like I can make that work. Like one core thing in the business model that I think is I discovered probably way too late is I originally had the game on sale for $9, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is everyone told me I was an idiot for underpricing it, and I was an idiot for underpricing it. Part of the problem with pricing it at $9 is that I couldn't make money off of ads. Like what other people do is they will buy ads to advertise the game and then convert to a sale. But the cost of acquiring a new customer was exceeded the money. Yeah, exactly. And
Yep.
so that avenue was closed to me. So part of my goal is once I get to the point where I have not just a base game for now I've actually raised the price to $15, but once I have a base game that's $15, and let's say I have a couple of expansions, $9 here, $9 there,
Mm-hmm.
now the lifetime value of a customer is much higher. Now they could give me $50, if they like all the stuff that I've got. And so now it's worth it to do advertising because now I can spend, $20 to acquire a customer, but on average I get that money back.
Yep.
So these are all things that I kind of didn't know when I first started. because I'm an idiot. I mean, because none of us really know this.
Yeah.
But now I think I can kind of see where the business model could work,
Mm-hmm.
with that kind of model.
Yep. And like as you're describing, like as you're talking about kind of how much money that can actually come from the game, come from consumers. I was just literally watching the Valve's talk about turning Team Fortress 2 to free to play,
Oh,
and
interesting.
one of the things that they were talking about, like this was back in 2014 when they, or no, I think it was 2012 when actually they did a talk about it, was this idea that the problem with the original model, of course, is that if you're trying to support a game for years and years and years of content, if somebody just buys it one time, you're not getting more development money out of that. That's it. And they had to figure out a way to essentially say, we want to keep developing this game, but we also still need money coming in to develop said content. And they just discussed this whole idea of slowly but surely building up the value of the side items, creating the store, and allowing people to charge for that. And I think one point they said I think was really good was that it basically transformed their consumers so that instead of somebody just spending $40, $20, and that's it for the rest of their life, they may buy the game for free and then they could spend $80 on cosmetics. Maybe someone else spends $150. Maybe someone only spends 10. But it basically opens every consumer up to essentially lifetime purchases with that model.
I love that. I mean, I do think that's the right model. But again, getting back to the types of games, not all games will work in that model. You kind of have to have these large, rich world kind of games. And again, one where the community is really supporting a lot of, what you're doing. The other problem that I had with Transcendence was I think that also only works if the base game is something that people love, that resonates with people. And one problem I had very early on with Transcendence was it was just too hard to play. I mean, there were the difficulty level was just wrong. It was kind of designed for me, and or for expert players who had played Transcendence for a couple of years. And also there were a lot of little quality of life and usability issues, the kind of things that you don't think matter but actually really really do. They don't matter to you anymore because you're an experienced player and you know everything about the game, but to that new player who's deciding in the first minute, do I like this game, those little quality of life are actually very important. So
yes, again,
you know this, right? You know this like intimately.
Again, for the new people watching, again, like UI UX, those are my, if I spot those issues, that's the warning that this game is not going to work. And and George, if you pulled up the stream, we do have the chat up, so there are a few people chatting. Looks like you have someone who's been playing Transcendence on and off for 20 years.
Oh, that's awesome. I love that. I love like that's kind of like my community, the longtime players who've just been around for so long. I love that. Thank you for tuning in.
Yeah, and like as you're describing like Transcendence's model, it really reminded me of Arkham Games, who did AI Wars. And like AI Wars I think went very much that similar way, that you buy the base game and then there are just expansions after expansion and it just keeps growing into that bigger thing. But again, I think it also had that same issue of approachability. And I think that's one of the things, again, like for the regulars watching this live record, that I can rant about approachability for hours on end. But it's still, I think, something that for a lot of first-time developers, even some of the more established indie devs, that they tend to suffer with. Especially when it's a game that, it's your baby, so you know it inside and out. You know every single button, command, tutorial. But then you try to put it in front of someone who's never played it before, and they're just sitting there going, what the hell am I looking at here?
Right. Yeah, that's always hard. And it's always hard as a game developer. Watching people play your own game is really hard at first, right? You're watching them play your baby, and it's just nerve-wracking. So I think a lot of developers avoid it, and I think that's much to their detriment. I kind of had to get over that. really quickly. Like when people do Twitch broadcasts of themselves playing Transcendence. I don't get that many, but there's plenty. There's some. I watch those because I really want to see kind of how they
Yeah.
do things, and I learn, that I play the game very differently from how my players do it. So I totally agree with you. That feedback is so important.
Mm-hmm. And with a lot of the games that we've seen, one thing that kind of resonated with me as you were describing was like kind of like the RPG where your character is a spaceship. I don't know if you ever played the game Drox Operative by Soldak Entertainment.
No, I haven't, but I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah, that was one of the things that I really liked about that one. And of course, you mentioned at the start Star Control, which is one of my all-time favorites. And it is one of those very like interesting ideas of, you know, we've seen the space sim genre really evolve and explode in all manner of directions, especially the last 10 years. I have a friend, Brian Rubin, who does Space Gamer Junkie, and he just does
Yes.
it's basically like his MO is all of the space games.
Oh yeah, no, I've been on the show once or twice. That's a great. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you've had him on recently, but I'm sure he could talk for hours about space
Oh,
games.
yes.
You're right. I think space games are kind of going through a renaissance. There's a ton of like these Starship Simulator type things.
Hmm.
Ton of these people. I mean, one of these days, Star Citizen might even come out. I mean, we'll see how that goes. But yeah, it's kind of exciting. It's kind of I think it's kind of cool.
Hmm. So, I guess
Sorry, let me just say one more thing about space games because it
Sure.
just reminds me. No Man's Sky. The interesting thing about No Man's Sky is if you remember kind of how that worked out, where the first release, just basically didn't meet expectations. Whatever the expectations were, whatever the game was, people thought that the game as released was not really what it was promised to be, or not what they
Hmm.
expected. And they kind of got hit hard for it, even though it's an amazing game. Um, and now what I love about them is that now they've gone back and they're kind of backfilling and kind of making the game. They're sticking with the game. There's not just okay, we're done with that. Let's do something different. They're like putting in all the things that they kind of always wanted to put in, that would meet their vision. I do really think they're going to meet their vision, and it's going to be
Hmm.
like this amazing thing. And because they're just working on it. But the downside, I think, for them is all the new things that they worked on they couldn't do as expansions, right?
Hmm.
Because they felt they kind of had to, kind of prove that the core game was good. So they kind of had to do them as free upgrades, which I'm sure costs a ton of money in terms
Oh,
of
yes.
development. They had a ton of money because it's just such a popular game. So I think it worked out for them fine. Um, but I bet, I think other indies, you kind of really want to have that solid core game so that you can start going to the expansions. You don't want to do it like me and have to start backfilling, kind of fixing all the all the problems in the core game before you do expansions.
Yeah, and it is very difficult. I just actually picked up No Man's Sky while it was on sale last Black Friday, and at
Hmm.
some point I'll get around to all the other games I have to play. And yeah, like that has been kind of like the major example people still bring up of a game that just people bought day one and it just like went in the wrong direction for a lot of them. And yeah, like you said, like they've been releasing, like it seems like every year or several times each year, there's some new, major change to that game, and it seems like they have, walked it back a lot. But I think, and I'm sure you've ran into this as well with Transcendence being like considered early access, or with that kind of long tail, is you're always going to have people wondering, is this game going to get done? Is this
Yeah,
game actually going, why should I buy it now when I can wait 6 months, 2 years, 5 years, it doesn't matter, and then buy the finished version or the
right,
complete version?
right. When right, because if you buy it now, there's a risk it never gets done.
Yep.
There's a risk that developers just drop it. No, I do think that's a big problem. And so I think there's someone like Caves of Cud does it pretty well in that I need to learn a little bit more from them because, for instance, they just do much more frequent updates.
Hmm.
So when you go to their Steam page, you see that the most recent update was like 2 weeks ago or a month ago. And so that, I think, gives people the confidence that this game is still going on. It's not a dead game. If you see a Steam page and the last update is from 2 years ago, you just don't know.
Oh yes.
So yeah, so I think that kind of stuff again, and again, this is a different model from how you might release the smaller games. The smaller games you release, you're done. The players play for their 6 hours and then they never play it again, and now you're on to the next game. So this is a very different model where you're really trying to support the community to continue playing.
Yeah, and two, Manian, and hopefully I didn't butcher that too badly. They were talking about the Star Sector that focuses on user interface and don't really update history for Delta 5 there. And yeah, like that's always that issue when you have these games be in development for so long. Like I've seen games that get either you buy day one and then nothing changes. So, if you hate it on day one, it never got fixed. Or you buy on day one and it just is a completely different game now, and it may not even be the game that you expected it to be. And like I've seen developers unfortunately chase both sides of that, and apparently we got some spam in there. Let me get rid of that.
Yeah, it is. I think it is hard. Another problem that often happens is take a game like FTL. FTL, another amazing game. That also super super popular. FTL. I think when a lot of people played it, they want it to be even bigger, right? They kind of almost want the RPG version of FTL, because FTL kind of paints this full world, and you almost want to dive in more into the FTL world, right? You want to do more than just kind of that one little scenario. But of course, the developers decided they'd move on to something else, which is all great and all. But that's another case where I think, I mean, again, it's working for them. I'm not criticizing them. But from the fans' perspective, I can totally see them saying, God, I really would love, like a larger world of FTL. If they'd spent more, if they'd kind of put out expansions every year, I bet you they just would sell 1 million of them.
Yeah, but again, like the challenge of that is if it doesn't sell, then you've just basically thrown money into the oven, and it's never going to come out there. And it is that very big risk, because I've seen the same with a lot of the games that I play. Oh, it's done, but can you just work on 10 more hours of content? Can you just put out 3 more expansions? Make the game even better. But and again, like I'm sure. Like someone like you who's working on one game, that I'm sure I don't know, it's very hard to come up with new amazing original ideas and just say, oh, I'll just put that out every 3 months. I can come up with something completely original every 3 months. It's that simple.
Yeah, no, it's hard. I mean, I think another way to deal with that I also try to deal with is you just have to be more efficient in game development. Because again, you're absolutely right. I mean, you can't put a ton of money in terms of development time into something like an expansion or whatever, and just not be able to recoup the cost. And so I think part of what I have to do, and this I'm pretty happy that I'm trying to be more and more efficient. You kind of just have to make things, make it easier and easier to produce the content. So I've worked a lot on the tools. It's still not that great, but I've worked a lot on the tools in Transcendence to make it easier to create content. I remember Paul Ritchie and Fred Ford were talking about how they had created a bunch of tools for generating content. That's, I mean, to me, that's absolutely the way to go. You got to get to this tool chain where it's really, really efficient, where you're at designer level instead of programmer level. doing that. And I'm not there with Transcendence by any means. That a bunch of my players will chime in because there's a ton of modding stuff in
Mm-hmm.
Transcendence going on, and everyone's always complaining about how hard it is to mod. So I'm definitely not there yet, but every release it makes it it's a little easier for me to create content. That next like little bit of content,
Mm-hmm.
so that's another thing you have to do as kind of a if you pursue this path, the stick with one game.
Mm-hmm. So with like as you've been planning this game out, and again you're thinking about this on an expansion model, how do you approach kind of like what needs to be in the game right now? What needs to be in kind of the base game versus what is expansion content? What does, expansion one,
Yeah.
2, 3, 4 look like for this?
Yeah, that's a great one. That's a great question. And again, I mean, it really depends a lot on the type of game. But what I usually try to do is I try to do a blend of both new content and new mechanics. So, you'll do, like the expansions that I have, for instance, now will open up new sectors of the galaxy, new places where the player can explore. That's kind of just new content. And so there's new enemies there, there's new weapons that you can find, there's new treasures that you can find. That's new content, and you do it. But at the same time, I always want to put in some new mechanics. So, like for instance, one of the expansions, the Corporate Command expansion, has an Auton Bay where you can
Mm-hmm.
repair your, drones, which we call Autons in the game. And so that's a new mechanic because now you're kind of trading some resource to repair some of your ships instead of having to buy new ones. I also try to just kind of add enough of those new mechanics and then just have more content. I think that's kind of how I try to approach it. And so from deciding what's on the base game and what's not, I kind of try to leave a little bit of room, for both new mechanics and new content. The core game doesn't have the whole map, the whole universe.
Mm-hmm.
It's got kind of this core, and then the expansions are gonna just add little regions around it.
Mm-hmm.
That happens to work really well with Transcendence. I don't know how it'll work with other games, but it
Mm-hmm.
has worked pretty well.
And the chat's on about mods, how they contribute to the long tail of games, and yeah, definitely. And
That yes, that's super insightful, and that has certainly been my experience with Transcendence. I get a lot of people. There's a lot of players who have not played the vanilla game in years, but
Mhm.
are still like every day on the forums talking about Transcendence, and it's because it's all about mods. And I do love that, and that's also honestly one of the things that I'm very passionate about is kind of giving people the tools to create, in a sense, their own games. I have some players who are working on total conversions. Kind of they've got their own vision for what they want a space game to be like, and they're just building it all on the same engine. Um, so I love that. That's one of the things that I love supporting, and it helps the community, right? Because that just attracts people to the game. There's a lot of players who say that Transcendence is useless without mods.
Mm.
It's horrible. The vanilla game is you have to play with mods, and I got no problem with that. I mean, I have absolutely no problem with that. I think I love it. I'm very proud of the fact that people have created mods to kind of make the game playable for them. They've in a way filled in some of the pain points. So yeah, I love it.
Yep. And with like trying to figure out those pain points and just kind of getting those updates, I think again, like one of the challenges is what is the kind of core experience of your game? Because we've seen mods or games that have done everything from, simply fixing text updates or fixing text to
Yeah.
completely rebalancing systems to even removing things that fans don't like. Like anyone who's played a game like XCOM, for instance,
Yep.
or XCOM 2, like there are a ton of mods, and Discord is like acting really weird to me lately. I'm not sure why it's wanting to kind of like spaz out. Thank you, Discord. Really a great time for that. Oh, and now there's a siren outside my window. It all happens all at once. But while that's going,
Yeah, we're fine. Go ahead.
with kind of like looking at the mods people have done for Transcendence, has any of them kind of become like adopted as kind of like actual features or
Oh,
brand
sure.
new additions and changes to it?
Oh, sure. Oh, sure. No, absolutely. I mean, like I said, a lot of people will end up will have pain points, and decide, hey, like, I mean, I'll give you an example. Um, right now when you repair your armor, a ship's armor has, multiple segments, like 4 or 5 segments. And right now in the
Mm-hmm.
user interface, you kind of have to go to each segment and repair it individually. But why? Why not just have a button that says repair all? If you've got the
Mm-hmm.
money, just like do it. So that was probably one of the first mods. It's like little things like that just people said, God, this is annoying. I'm just gonna fix it. So that kind of stuff for sure I want to like rip off. I haven't yet ripped off that one because it's embarrassing, but I haven't yet ripped it off. But I will. I will. I promise I will. But there's a ton of those things that I have that I have seen in a mod and said, oh man, that really should be in the base game. Another player, for instance, did. You could right now in the game when you destroy a ship, it just turns into a wreck and you loot it, and you can
Mm-hmm.
get its equipment. But they added a mod where you can kind of resurrect the ship, kind of repair the ship, and it turns into a ship that's part of your fleet now. Again, another relatively obvious feature and an awesome feature, um, but one that the base game doesn't have. And I'm like, oh man, that we should totally do that. So yeah, I think it's pretty cool. Again, the limitation for me is almost always time.
Yep.
There's way too many ideas for me to try to build them all into core. And so what I try to do is leverage. So often what'll happen too is a player will say, "Hey, I want to do this mod, but I can't quite. I don't have the API. I don't have the access to this one piece of the game. Can you do that?" And they'll say, "Sure," and I'll build it into the engine so that it's so that they can now change it rather than me doing it. So I do like the concept of making the engine more and more moddable to help people do whatever they want, rather than me fixing whatever problem that they're trying to mod away. That to me is kind of leverage. It just allows them to start creating new content around the game. So I love that.
Mm-hmm. And with like trying to build like multiple expansions and the idea, so like I said earlier, like right now people can buy what's considered episode one.
Right.
So as you're thinking about like each episode of Transcendence, I guess what is kind of like your philosophy in terms of how big do you want these to be? Like, is this going to be, like a new system? Could it be like, as big as like an expansion pack back in the day? Like, how are you approaching that kind of development?
That's it's a lot of times I'll do it based on time, how much
Mm-hmm.
time I want to allocate. So if and again it's pretty much mostly just me doing the development. So if it's a year, if I say I've got a year, to work on an expansion, then it's going to be, it's relatively small. It's going to maybe add, one or two systems, one or two new systems. It's going to add, maybe a dozen weapons, a dozen new weapons, 2 or 3 new enemy types, that kind of stuff. So relatively compact. And we play tested, we kind of balance it all. If it's longer, like for part two of the game, kind of episode two of the game, that's a much larger chunk that I've kind of been working on, and every year I make a little bit of progress. Every year a little bit of progress, and I'm hoping hopefully by the end of this next year, 2022, to kind of have some of that come out, and people can start seeing episode two. But that's taken a much more time because it's a much larger game. It's got many more 40, 50 star systems. It's got many new races and ship types, and so that's taken a lot longer, certainly, than I expected. But that's kind of how I do it. I do it by time. I say, okay, well, how much time do I want to devote to this? Then that's how big it's going to get.
Mm-hmm.
But the other thing I want to say in general, in thinking about Transcendence specifically, and I think this applies to these kinds of long tail games where you're always adding to it. I, a lot of times I think of it as in when you're doing like stand up improv, people say the answer is always yes. When someone asks, you always accept the premise. People say, "Why is there a duck on your head?" You always kind of accept the premise and just go on with it. Um, I feel the same way in Transcendence when people ask, "Hey, wouldn't it be cool if you could pilot, warships? Wouldn't it be cool if you could, blow up a sun? Wouldn't it be cool if you could?" I always say, yeah, that would be cool. And I think about how we could kind of build it into the game. In other words, I want the game to feel like, it's a universe that you can do anything you want in it. I mean, within the logic of the universe.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not, trying to do just anything, but within the logic of that sci-fi space opera universe, you should be able to do anything in that world. And so I think there will always be new features and new things for me to add. As players kind of decide, gosh, I'd really love to be the crime lord and own 3 space stations, and bit by bit, I'm going to try to add all that stuff.
So I'm wondering, do you have like a list somewhere of like all suggestions people have pitched? That you're kind of like, maybe I can do this, I gotta do this, and that kind of thing.
I do. We have a database. We have it's on Ministry of Records is my database. Ministry.chronosaur.com, and they're basically people. It's open to all players. People just kind of post their bugs, post their suggestions, and then I kind of categorize and decide these are for far in the future. These are whoops, I got to fix this right now. So yes, that I do keep that list, and it's a huge list. I mean, it's like thousands of entries. But bit by bit, I'm kind of like finding the pieces that are doable, that can be done, that should be done. But yeah, it's the only way to do it. Is you gotta get that list.
Yep. And I'm trying to think if there's anything else. I guess with like this kind of long tail design, I guess one thing that I've wondered about like games like the Transcendence, like what they do with AI wars and so on, is has it become easier for you to kind of think about the future of the game? Like, do you consider like Transcendence base game to be, I guess, quote unquote, done or feature complete at this point?
Yes and no. I mean, I do think it's done in the sense that the majority of the work is going to happen in expansions.
Mm-hmm.
But I also feel that that every expansion is going to require changes to the engine, which will end up kind of benefiting the base game. But I do think there's, especially with this latest release with 1.9, I feel like it's at a good inflection point where the bulk of my effort is going to go towards expansions, things that will kind of be outside the core game, but obviously play with it. This 1.9 I feel is a pretty decent. It's kind of the first game where I can say, yeah, play this. I want you to play this and you like it. I'm not going to be embarrassed. Whereas I think previous versions I could say, yeah, I know it's still pretty crappy. So yeah, I do feel pretty good about where we are now.
Yeah, man, I think that's always been like one of the challenges of presenting this game to new people. And when we talk about kind of games that have gone very much long tail, stuff like Dwarf Fortress as a really good example, that
yeah,
they tend to unfortunately lose people, or it becomes hard to get into these games when it's a 5 year, 10 year, 15 year project, and somebody new joins and it's like, okay, this game now has, you know, 50 different systems. What the hell am I looking at here?
Yes. Yeah, no, that is absolutely, that's a really good point. It's absolutely one of the dangers is absolutely that you've created such a deep world that now there's no entry point to it. You can't,
Mm-hmm.
that a casual player can't figure out what's there, how to play
Mm-hmm.
it. So I do agree with that. I do think that's a challenge. Dwarf Fortress, I think, particularly has that challenge. Um, but in a way, they've kind of just leaned into it, right? I mean, that's part of the attraction of Dwarf Fortress, I do think, is its difficulty. That's kind of the first thing all reviewers comment on. Um, but something like Caves of Cod, I do think have done it differently. They also just very recently added levels of
Yep.
difficulty, kind of story mode, wandering mode, and I do think that's a good, which is very similar to what I did in 1.9 and Transcendence 1.9. Um, I do think that's very helpful for getting people in there, kind of a way of exploring the game without being blocked at every point because you don't know what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
That's I yeah, that's I think the way to go with these long tail games is make sure that they're accessible. You always got to think of that first new time user, new time player. It's that's I think critical to get people into it. That's honestly been the biggest problem with Transcendence is that people bounced off the game very quickly.
Yep.
Partly because of the difficulty level, partly because, like I said, quality of life. Um, um, so fixing that was really one of my major priorities.
Yep. And for developers watching us right now, again, the word of the day is onboarding. If your onboarding is bad, especially if it is a game that's meant around very long play and long development, people aren't going to stick with it. And I've seen some amazing games or some very fascinating ones over the last 5 years that they all look impressive. They're like unique experiences, and then you go to play them, and it's like, oh my god, how the hell am I controlling this?
Right.
Who did the UI? And of course, someone will say, oh, it gets better after 20 hours of play. And then you get, of course, that lovely question. Oh, so I have to suffer for 20 hours and then I can start playing this game.
Right. Right. Oh, absolutely. And for sure, Transcendence was one of those games. That was absolutely, that showed up in the stats where people, the longtime players could like go through the whole game and they'd like, they'd see the whole universe and they'd talk about, oh yeah, I love that scene, 20 systems in where you blah 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 blah. And the new players would like get, 30 minutes in one system and they're like, nah, I'm out, because they just couldn't play it.
Yep.
So yeah, no, I agree. And the tricky part also from kind of a design perspective is how do you do that without alienating your core audience, right? Because you obviously
Oh,
don't,
yes.
right. I mean, you don't want to dumb it down so that now it's kind of totally different from what the core audience wants and loves, but you still need to make it accessible. I don't know that I've gotten the right balance. I mean, the obvious thing is levels of difficulty, and people have accepted that pretty well. My core audience has accepted that, I think, pretty well. So I think that's worked. For other games, maybe they would do things differently.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but the other thing that I think works well in Transcendence that again, other games I think also do is Transcendence is kind of there's a simple mechanic that is infinitely expandable. So I'll give you an example. You go on a ship and there's a command to dock with a station, right? So you're flying around, there's a station, you dock with it. Now, that's a super simple mechanic, right? That's all you have to know is press D to dock. And the help system tells you press D to dock. But what happens when you actually get to the station can be completely different. At some stations, you get a menu that says, okay, well, here's what you can trade. At other stations, it like starts a mission. At other stations, it's, bounty hunter run or whatever. And so what I think works is that you don't have to learn very much, but yet you get all these different experiences, and you don't have to know the full thing. You don't have to know anything about bounty hunter missions, until you actually get there. So that's kind of a way where you're kind of slowly disclosing the different layers of the game with one simple mechanic, just dock, and then you get that.
Hmm.
I mean, obviously, I didn't invent that. Every single game has that. That's probably I probably lifted that from Star Control for all I know.
Yeah, like for me, the thing that always gets me with a lot of the kind of open space sim games is just that feeling of, okay, I'm going to start, and then all I'm told is, okay, hit this button to fly, go over here. You're done. There's a tutorial.
Yeah,
Here, just enjoy. And I'm just sitting there going, enjoy what? I have no idea what the hell is left to do in this game.
that's also a super hard problem,
Hmm.
and that yeah. So another problem that I have, because the game is 2D right now. Transcendence is 2D top down,
Hmm.
right? And so the way, like, say, 3D game designers, the way somebody like Skyrim would solve that problem is by showing things in the horizon that
Hmm.
are kind of attraction points. Like Breath of the Wild does this amazingly, but
Hmm.
all kind of RPGs do this. They show you things off in the distance that you want to go to. A giant castle, a massive mountain, and now as the player, you self-form your missions. You're just like, well, I just want to check that out, and so you start doing it, and off you go, and then you start getting into fights, and you upgrade. It's like done. For a top-down game like Transcendence, you don't get that as much, and so I kind of had to invent that a little bit, where there's kind of a mode where you see kind of the whole system, and even when you first enter a system, even if you've never been there, you see kind of the planets and the asteroid fields and all that, and I hope that gives you a sense of, whoa, let me check that out. And what's that type of planet? That's a new planet I've never seen before. Let me check that out. Um, so I've had to kind of compensate, but
Hmm.
adding more and more of those kind of things, those kinds of attraction points for players, where they naturally think, oh, I should do this. That's, I think, I want to work more on that. I think I mean, that just would make the game so much better.
Yep, and like the funny thing is that even though I love Star Control 2, like I've yet to find like another, open space simi style game to really pull me in as well as that one did. And I think a lot of that, I think in the first conversation I had with Paul and Fred, was that they weren't interested in building a space sim. It was
Right.
more of, this sci-fi novella, and it just so happens that you have this whole universe to explore, and it worked well. I've yet to beat Star Control 2. It's on my list of games I need to actually try and sit down and finish one day.
I have not either. I have
Yeah,
not. I probably shouldn't confess this to all my players, but no, I have not. I haven't beaten Star Control 2 either.
yeah,
um,
but
but I agree with you. I mean, I think Star Control 2, it's not about the mechanics or the tactics. It's about the story. I do think it's. I mean, that's one of the things I just loved. I did the grind. The grinding through all the gathering the minerals and
oh
upgrading your ship
yes,
to get to the next planet, so I can see the dialogue. Let me just go see the whatever, the
oh yes,
Merquans. Let me just get. So I did. I love that. That was kind of my. I do think Star Control is about that storyline, that space opera storyline,
hmm,
and they did it, I think, better than most.
yeah. And I wanted to point out this comment Ishimanian made about seemingly changing the long tail from the shareware freeware days, and that is certainly true. Like,
Yes.
another developer I spoke to, of course, was Jeff Vogue, who is famously known from Spireweb Software. And he's been making games since I think 1993, 1994 through his own
Wow.
website. And he has spoken a lot about how, there are people out there who they hate Steam. There are a lot of smaller indie
Sure.
devs who are like, I'm never going to go on Steam. It's all away. I don't, Steam is just not important to me. But it's so important to remember that 20 years ago, 30 years ago, you weren't going to have that easeability or that usability, being able to just easily patch your games and support it long term. And that was something that I've spoken a lot about when it comes to digital platforms. And it is such a big deal for not just with a game like Transcendence, but any indie game these days.
Yes.
That as a consumer, I don't need to hunt down patches. I don't need to worry about going to some random download site and get viruses. I go on Steam, it says update, hit the button, I'm done. My game's fully patched. And the
Yep.
workshop, I think, has also been another brilliant addition.
Yes. Yeah, no, I mean Steam for sure. I mean, and it's not just the kind of technical details of updating the game, it's the discoverability of knowing that there's an update. You go to
Mm-hmm.
Steam to play, whatever you want to play, and it says, hey, up Transcendence just updated. And you're like, oh, okay, let me check that out. There's no way you would get that on, if you're just kind of marketing it yourself. No one's going to be hitting your blog every day to just see if you got a new update. So Steam, I really think has helped an immense amount. I get obviously 90 to 95% of my sales through Steam compared to my own site or other platforms. So empirically, that is where people are buying games, at least Transcendence.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And I think when it comes to like these kinds of games, especially if you're trying to develop it long term, you need that easy portal for
Yeah.
people to find information on. And as a developer, it also gives you the ability that your fan base is localized. You don't need to search message boards or Reddit groups or anything like that. You just go to, Transcendence Forum, there you go.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah, I do think that Steam has done that. I mean, I get why people complain about Steam because it is hard to get noticed,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's a classic case of the power power law where the top 1% get
Mm-hmm.
90% of all the traffic, because those are
Mm-hmm.
the popular games. That's absolutely true. I think as an indie developer, part of the trick is to try to figure out how to find your niche in that place, to try to move kind of towards the right, I guess, where there's to get higher and higher sales, because it builds on itself, right? The more people buy your game, the more people get told about your game through
Mm-hmm.
Steam, right? Steam's algorithm is kind of self-reinforcing, so the more you can get people to buy your game, the more Steam's going to help to kind of get the snowball going. So if you can get that going, you can really do it. I can't say that I've cracked that and I've finally figured out how to do that. But it's for an indie game. I mean, again, I'm totally in the long tail in terms of revenue, but it's still, even now, 5 years after release, it's still about $8,000 to $10,000 a year in terms of just sales on Steam pretty regularly. Between kind of a little sales here and there, a little festival type notice. So it's Steam, I think, is absolutely very viable for these kind of games.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it is a tough situation. It's something that I've spoken about a lot here on the channel. That, as you just said, as I'm sure everyone knows, that it is a case of the rich getting richer. That if your game does well its first week, it will most likely continue to do well. And if it doesn't do
Yep.
well its first week, Valve is just basically
Yep.
good luck.
Yep.
Here are the wolves. We're going to throw you out there to
Yep.
them.
Yep. No, and I mean, you
Mm-hmm.
you can't blame them, right? I mean,
Yeah.
if a game is not selling, you're not helping players by telling them about games that they're probably not going to like.
Mm-hmm.
So I totally see that. I think, again, from my perspective as an indie, the way I react to that kind of stuff is try to figure out, okay, what do I need to do to my game to get it to be more popular, to get it to be more acceptable, to get it to get more people to tell their friends. So I kind of spend more of my energy on that, thinking, okay, well, why is it that people aren't buying the game or aren't liking the game, and then just fix those problems and work on those. And I do feel I've made a ton of progress in that. I mean, again, even though like my sales are actually consistently like growing slightly, even though like normally you would actually have an effect where the sales like exponentially decrease every year. That's what happens with most games is you get a ton of sales at the first year, and then the next year it's like half that, and then the next year after that is half that and half that, and eventually just trails to nothing. I've actually kept it up at a decent, well, I mean, at a level, by kind of constantly improving the game, constantly getting more players into it. So yeah, it's for sure tricky, but I do feel like there are ways to work with it. Again, there's a bunch of indie games that I think are much better examples of success in that area, that have been able to retain the attention, and make a ton of money off of Steam.
Yeah, and to Ishimanian's comment there about, yeah, they've been trying to do more with, having creators. The
Yes.
festivals, I think, have been a pretty good success for them.
Yeah, the festivals I think make a lot of sense. Yeah, I think the problem, honestly, obviously discoverability is one thing. I think the other problem is there. Most people know this. There isn't enough time to play all the new games that come out,
Uh,
right?
yeah, like for people who watch me, like I didn't play like 90 games in the last festival over a week, and my mind is completely forgotten most of those games at this
Right.
point.
Right. I mean, it's an embarrassment of riches. I mean, in a way, it is kind of the best of times for players because they get
Mhm.
just so many, amazing. Well, most of them are amazing, games. Um, but yeah, the problem is it doesn't matter if Steam, kind of puts this game in front of your face. Um, there's still so many of those games out there that the chance of you like saying, okay, I'm going to play it, and then telling your friends, it's there's just so many games, so it's really hard. The upside, because I don't want this to be a downer. I mean, I do really think this is the indie dev world. The upside is that there are so many people on Steam that I think every game can find its niche. There's like my game is never going to be it's never going to be the most top 10 game on Steam. It's always going to be a niche game, but even a niche game on Steam can be super large for an indie developer. I mean, large enough to support a nice gaming studio. I'm never going to be EA, but I absolutely think that can support a thriving game studio.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think going back to what you were saying earlier about kind of how Steam markets games, like one of the challenges of long tail games like this is that it's rare to, I think, outside like big names like the Team Fortress, Dead by Daylight, like when they put out a new patch or a new content update, the store becomes dominated by that. And
Yeah.
this was something that Valve was talking about in the video that I was watching. That for every new update they did at Team Fortress, there was a spike in interest and a spike of sales. But when you're dealing with smaller games or games where I guess the patches or the expanders are quote unquote flashy, we just added 3 new ships or we just
Yep.
updated the
Yep.
UI,
Yep.
that doesn't scream, hey, look at me, my game's doing this, look at me, look over here.
Yeah.
And
Yep.
it is that difficulty of you could, and there are developers who will save patches and save content for that one mega
Yeah.
patch. And I think that's kind of what No Man's Sky did. And I think Firaxis also follows that model as well, that they typically don't release little bits of updates. Like when Firaxis release a patch or an expansion to XCOM, that's just basically, okay, all those issues you guys have been talking about the last like 6 months, a year, they're all fixed. And I think while there are benefits to that, one of the hardest things, and I think this is something that you can certainly speak about, is keeping people interested in a
Yeah.
long tail game. Because again, the whole model is that you need to have people who want to keep playing this game and want to keep paying for stuff. So if you
Yeah.
lose their interest, or if, let's say, you don't develop anything that they resonate with for 3, 4 patches, they may leave and they may not come back, even if you do something amazing a year and a half down the line.
You're totally right. No, you're totally right. That's absolutely right. I mean, I think this is, I think, why you find that a lot of these long tail games end up being kind of what I call epic scale, right?
Mm.
Because you're almost selling the vision of what the game can be as much of the current state of the game. So, with Transcendence, I'm kind of the pitch to my players is, look, we're building this massive universe, and I've built some piece of it, but with mods building other pieces, and as we go more expansions, this universe is getting bigger, and you can do more and more things. My pitch is, the vision is, we're going to build something as large as, well, I'm not going to say Star Citizen, but at least as large as Elite Dangerous. We can at least do that. Just, in 2D and, in kind of constrained mechanics, not in, 3D space. And painting that vision, I think, is what I think helps people to tune in every year and see, okay, well, how far did they get this time? How far are they? Caves of Cud is another, is again, I always mention them, that they're similar. They kind of have this expansive vision. Dwarf Fortress, obviously has a massive vision. Tales of Majal, all these kind of long tail indie games, I think they survive because they are epic in scale, and you kind of keep on wanting to see how far they've gotten. No Man's Sky, I think, is the path, that's the path they're going to. They're choosing, to be, just keep on adding things and make this universe amazing, and the vision that they're painting, I think, is what keeps people coming back to check the development.
Mm-hmm.
So getting people excited with the vision, what this game can be, I feel is kind of a key ingredient.
Mm-hmm. And to Ishimonian's comment there, the way consumers have purchased games have changed. Instead of the majority of sales being made in the first month, it's now in the first 2 years, or one of the major publishers. And it has changed. I think, like, on one of my shows that I do called Completion Critiques, where I look at the achievements and how much people play through games and see really where retention and churn happen, that I try to wait at least 2 to 3 years, because you're always going to have first month, first week adopters. They're your super hardcore, but over like months and years, you'll have people pick up games through sales, through word of mouth. But there always comes that point, at least with traditional games, where that's it. Like, everyone who's going to buy the game has already bought it.
Yeah. So there I'll say again, I think the advantage there is that for indie games, the set of players is far, far larger than you think. I mean, for instance, for this last release, for the last release of Transcendence 1.9, I just put out, a week ago, there are a bunch of comments of people that purchased it who said, "I never heard of this game. This is awesome. This is exactly what I was looking for." And that's because, obviously Transcendence is such a niche game. 99.999% of the people in the world haven't heard of it. So I feel like, for indie niche games, I actually do think that there's most people have not heard of it, and you'll always be able to kind of entice them, because for some people this is exactly what they're looking for, whether it's because fondness for Star Control, or there was a game called Eevee Nova, which is very, I don't know if you remember that. It was a Mac game, but this is another game that a lot of people resonate with. Endless Sky is the other one that a lot of people compare this to. So for a lot of people who kind of have heard of those games and they love it, then they hear of Transcendence, they're like, I gotta give that a try. That's kind of my type of game. I feel like I haven't even reached 10% of all those people that might be interested in the game.
Yeah.
So
and that's another, I think, really important point, because one of the challenges that we've spoken about a lot here on this channel is trying to find that consumer base. There are
Yes.
some games out there that they may just not appeal to anybody. It could be just this, crazy mishmash of genres, and let's say there's maybe only 200 people in the world who want that game. But then there are games where it's a fantastic concept, but it's just not, the points or the marketing aspects just aren't working for that game. And unfortunately, I think this is a sad truth to a lot of people watching this. Marketing and PR, I think, are more important than ever as an indie
Yes.
developer. You cannot get by just on the experience of your game. Like art. Like again, every when you say art to a developer, they get like a little bit, I think, of a pain in their chest there. It does matter. Like if somebody takes one look at your game and they go, "What the hell is that?" or anything like that, it does not matter if you
Yep.
have 10,000 hours of gameplay. You are never going to hook that person.
Yep. Yep. No, I 100% buy it. And so the other irony is that a lot of these indie game studios rely on word of mouth, right? You obviously don't have the marketing budget to,
Mm-hmm.
blow this out in a Super Bowl ad. So you rely on word of mouth. But the irony is that for a niche game, word of mouth is not the best way because, you know, by definition, it's a niche game. So out of your 10 friends, maybe only one of them really likes it. And so it like doesn't spread virally. Do you know what I mean? It's because you can't, what you really want is one of those games that is so popular that you tell 10 friends and 9 of them buy it. Because now they tell their 10 friends, it's now that's viral, that's viral. But niche games, you can't really rely on, or at least you have to. Again, this is where I go back to long tail. Um, the, the
Mm-hmm.
the the key is, as long as you're never losing players, as long as you're the players that you attracted 10 years ago come back to the game and buy that next expansion, right? You're
Mm-hmm.
you're growing, rather than being on that treadmill where every year you got to market and get more people to buy your game. It's if you can keep all the players that have been with you for the last, however many years, then the size of your market grows and grows and grows and grows. So that's why I think that's another reason why I think some of these long tail games have potential.
Mm-hmm.
But you're
And
right. I mean, marketing
yeah,
marketing is the hard part. That's the key.
yeah. And again, like the goal is you want to keep those people happy, and you also want to grow with new people, so that again the monetization model just keeps being refreshed and recycled. Because again, like as you just said, when it comes to niche games, when it comes to word of mouth kind of designs like that, what we often see is that you will have like 1,000, 2,000 people who will love this game to death. Nobody else will play that game. Like it is
Yep.
so niche driven that it becomes that echo chamber,
Yep.
and it is unfortunate when that happens.
Yep. Yeah, and that's something I think, obviously developers have to be really, really conscious of, is that, again, for me, I'm surrounded by people who already play the game, so they're always, focused on things that they already like the game, so the things they're telling me are in a way not super helpful. They're not going to help me attract. I really need to spend more time with the people that hate the game and see, why they hate it. So it's I totally agree. Trying to consciously try to figure out how to get that onboarding, how to get new people to, what is it about the game that can attract people? That's super important for developers. And another thing I'll say is I agree with you that some of it's not even game design, it's marketing. The took me a long time to figure out, for instance, that you, instead of building a game, taking a screenshot and then starting, marketing off that screenshot, you really should do the reverse. You start with a screenshot and then build a game that like matches that. You start with, here's what I want people to see that they've never seen before. This is what I want people to play and get people to get really excited about. And once you get that screenshot and people are like, whoa, I can't
Mm-hmm.
wait to play that, then you build a game.
Yeah.
Because if you do it the other way, it's backwards. It's not going to work.
And I've seen developers who wait until like the week before the game comes out before they actually start doing marketing.
Yeah.
And that also does not work.
Yeah.
And we do store page reviews here as well. We're always looking for submissions of games to check out. And yeah, like we've seen games that we can tell within seconds if the store page has any chance. Like the thumbnail. Like you said earlier, when it comes to the embarrassment of riches, like when I'm looking for games to like reach out to developers for, a lot of times I am just scanning thumbnails. And if your thumbnail is bad, a lot of people will equate that as your game is bad. And it's unfortunate, it's not fair, but again, when you are looking at between 30 to 50 games released daily, you don't have the time to give each game a 30-minute examination to figure out if it's something you want to play.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. I mean, that is such a huge thing. I mean, a lot of the advice I've heard about that is, again, make it easy on the player, the consumer, to see exactly what they're getting and see how it's exactly the same as something else that they really love. So it's almost backwards. Rather than trying to be really, really creative with marketing and trying to do something that no one's ever seen before, it's almost like you want to do something that everyone's seen before and loves, and so they can say, "Oh yeah, I played FTL and I loved it. I wish there were another game like FTL. Oh, that looks like it." That in a way almost is better, because you're absolutely right. I mean, you have like a
Mm-hmm.
second where they look at that capsule image and they're just gonna, it doesn't look good to them, they'll just go right by it.
Yep.
It's hard. I mean, being in the game, if we weren't passionate about it, if this isn't something that we just love to do, I don't know that people would do it, because it's just so hard. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I've been lucky because, again, I have kind of I have a consulting business where I can, not have to worry too much about, is my indie game going to pay for my mortgage? So I can spend time on my passion, but I know that most people aren't as lucky. A lot of indie game developers are not that lucky, and it's hard. It's very hard.
Oh, yes. So, as a quick time check, we are about 90 minutes in for this conversation. So, I think I'm just about out of questions for you. So, I think we begin to wrap things up. But for the chat watching, if you have any questions for George about Transcendence, about indie dev life, anything like that, feel free to post it now. And we'll probably do, or we'll wrap things up, I would say, in the next 10 to 15 minutes, give or take, if that works for you.
Yeah. Oh yeah, perfect. Yeah, no, that works.
Okay. So while we wait for any questions to come in, I guess as another point that we didn't touch on yet. So as we've said, you're working, or episode one is done, or that's where you're buying Transcendence for. What do you have planned? Like, do you have anything teased for episode two?
I do. Episode one kind of takes place in human space. So you visit Earth, you visit, kind of some of the colonies of, humanity, and it's all pretty much human type civilizations. In episode two, you kind of break out of the human quarantine zone and go into the galaxy where all the alien races are. And so that's, I think, it's a chance both to just see many, many more interesting, alien cultures and technologies and races, and it gives me a chance to do slightly different mechanics in terms of, how the ships fight with each other, how the upgrade progression goes, because it's just different technologies. So, for instance, in part two, there are biomechanical ships that, instead of upgrading piece by piece, you grow. So there's kind of like you feed them various things, and depending on kind of what you feed them, they kind of grow with different powers. And so it's just a very different mechanic for getting your ship to be. And that's just one of the technologies. There's other technologies for building ships. But again, the mechanics are very different from what they're like in episode one. So that's the kind of stuff that I'm excited about. I'm just excited about trying out some of those new things.
So I guess how do you decide, or how do you prioritize what you want for each expansion? I know like some developers, I know Arkin kind of lets it. They leave it up to their fans. They do like
Mm.
polls, or they have their own internal monitoring system where people can suggest ideas or what they want to focus on.
I do kind of bring in ideas from the fans. I often will post kind of what I call design requests. I'll kind of say a topic like, what kind of black market missions would be cool, and and say, post your ideas, to kind of target solicitation of ideas. And there have been many places where kind of I've kind of taken those ideas, so that has helped a lot. But in general, I try to kind of come up with a framework, an outline of what I want the expansion to be like. And it's usually either to try to broaden the universe, go into a new area of space that has different types of
Hmm.
civilizations, different type of aliens, or to try out new mechanics. So one of the expansions that I'm planning, and I've talked to my players about this a lot. One of the expansions that I'm planning is one where you get to command like a star carrier, and instead of right now in the game, you basically just fly around the ship, essentially single person. So you're kind of like literally steering the ship. But I'd like to do an expansion where you're commanding the whole carrier and the wing of gunships with it. So it's more like an RTS where you're like commanding, the ships to go to this target, that target, and you've got kind of a more of a God's eye view of what's happening. So that's a case where I'm planning the expansion around a certain mechanic, a certain different way, of experiencing, being in space. So yeah, those are the different things. I'm excited about that one too. I don't know how long it's going to take me to do that expansion, but I'm kind of excited about that one. That one. Sorry, let me just, because I always do get excited about it. It's that one. The pitch for that expansion is, um, you're kind of a middle manager, so you're the captain of the carrier with your wing of gunships, and you command the gunships. But the gunships essentially have a mind of their own. They're AI pilots, okay? But they have a chance to refuse your orders. So, for example, if one of their buddies gets like stranded out there, and you tell the wing, no, 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 don't risk the rest of the wing, just come everyone back, the pilots might decide, no, this is our buddy, we're going to save him no matter what, and they defy your orders and get into the enemies and maybe get killed. So there's kind of a chance where they depending on their loyalties, they may not follow your orders, and at the same time, the admiral, the whole war is giving you commands, and you have to decide to follow those orders. And sometimes those orders are going to be contradict kind of what your crew wants, right? Your admiral might tell you to like do a suicide mission, and now you're going to decide, whoa, is this really going to be good for the crew? So anyway, I'm excited to play with that kind of a concept. I'll see if it works or not.
Hmm. So here's one question that I wanted to ask you, George, about kind of again focusing on this long tail design, because it's another thing that I see developers kind of slip up on, and that is retreading on older content. What I mean by this is that, especially for games in early access, that developers may get into this habit of, I'm going to release content A, and then the next patch I'm going to try and fix content A, and then by fixing content A, now I need to fix content B, and it's
Yeah.
just this kind of two steps forward, three steps back issue, and especially for games that have a lot in terms of its design. Like I've seen, like when it comes to like free to play games and like long tail along those lines, that once the early game is done, those developers will basically seal in a vault. They will never touch that specific area again, unless it's like some very big situation. Like I know at some point during World of Warcraft's tenure that they decided to just completely redo, I think, the 1 to 60 game of that title. So
Yeah.
with Transcendence, I guess, how do you approach, I guess, the finality of what you've developed? Like, are there areas that you're just like, this is done, it is, etched in stone, I will never look at it again? Or are there parts where you're like, if I can or if people want, I can go back and do something or
That's
change this?
That's like a key question. That's a great question. Um, I definitely don't have, you know, a hard line. It's more God, how should I say it? It's kind of bang for the buck. It's I have a budget of time to work on. I have however many weeks of development time, and when I'm planning out the release or the expansion, I kind of decide, okay, what is it worth it to spend my time doing? You know, and for sure, if I don't want to ever get into a situation where I'm spending 80% of my time fixing kind of something else, some old thing that no one cares about. Um, as opposed to trying to push the envelope forward and creating some new content, creating a new expansion. So it really is all about budget. I try to say, I want 80% of my budget to be on creating new content so that I can have an expansion to sell. And then for that 20%, yeah, sure, there's places where, it's really embarrassing and I really should fix that. And so I go back and fix. But for the most part, that second piece, other than the really, really embarrassing stuff that's obvious, that's kind of where I do wait for players. I kind of reserve that little 20% where players will say, gosh, it's really annoying that you haven't fixed this yet. Please fix it. Or, gosh, if I had this one API feature, then I could do this mod that I've always wanted to do. Please do it. And that comes out of that 20% time. So budgeting, I feel is the best way for me to approach it.
Right. So I think with that, I mean, we can certainly wax on about indie dev for hours on end. Are there any other aspects about Transcendence, long tail design, anything at all that we haven't touched on that you wanted to discuss here?
We don't have time to talk about this, but one thing we haven't talked about is multiplayer because I think sometimes that helps with multiplayer design. I'm sorry, with long tail design.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Particularly when you get into whether it's competitive or collaborative multiplayer, because it does keep people kind of coming back. But we don't have time to talk about it. Other than I do think there's a ton of stuff that indie developers could do there, and that they should definitely consider it. I kind of wish I'd spent more time at the beginning in Transcendence planning for some kind of multiplayer features. I feel that might give the game more longevity. I know I'll get there eventually, but it's much harder now than if I'd done it at the beginning.
Oh,
Yeah,
for
yeah,
sure.
for
On
sure. Yeah, yeah,
both points there, right there. Yeah.
yeah. Co-op multiplayer games last forever. Yeah, Ishmanian is saying, yeah, yeah. I mean, that's the kind of stuff I agree. So I think indie devs, I think people should kind of consider that if they're trying to do these kind of long tail games.
Yeah, and that's something that I'm talking about in my next book on free to play design, on that very fact that when it comes to long tail and games as a service, almost all the successful games end with some major multiplayer component. Because, again, like it's something we've said before about content, like single player content, it has an expiration date. You finish it, it's done. Multiplayer content, as long as there are two people or how many you need for a multiplayer, it's endless because people will always want to either compete or cooperate with one another.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And especially any kind of multiplayer where you kind of build a presence, you've kind of accumulated capital or accumulated ships or accumulated territory in this multiplayer universe, MMO universe. Boy, that's sticky. That can get pretty sticky.
That's EVE Online, I think, right
Yeah.
there.
Yeah. No, but I mean, again, yes, for sure. I mean, there are ways to be evil about it. But there's also ways to make sure that it's fun for the players. But yeah, God, yeah. There's a whole lot of things with Transcendence. Transcendence, the core game is single player, and it's just too hard, I think, to change that without like redesigning. But I've toyed with and I've thought about ways of kind of doing, excuse me, multi-level multiplayer where the results of a single player game affect some larger strategic game. Where maybe there's even a way for players kind of doing a Galactic Conquest type game where they're sending orders down to single player, plays that turn into missions, and the results of those missions affect the overall world. So I don't know if that would work out, but that's kind of one of the things that I'm thinking about. I think there's a lot of opportunity for multiplayer stuff.
Hmm. So I think with that we can wrap things up, and if you're free in the future, we can always do a follow-up cast and such.
I would love that. I had such a great time, Josh. I mean, I think this is you got some amazing questions and great people on the channel on the forums. So yeah, please, anytime you want me back, I'm happy to come back.
Sure. Not a problem. So, for the people watching, do you have any timetable for the next expansion? You setting or like you're hoping for 2022?
Yeah, 2022. I mean, I'd love to get a decent beta by summer, fall next year. That's kind of my working, my working deadline. But all my players know that I'm horrible at deadlines. So so we'll see how realistic that is.
And actually, just one more question for you. I think this is another thing that we didn't touch on that I think is important about long tail design, and that is pricing. You mentioned
Yeah,
earlier that, of course, you raised the price up. I think it was $9.95 to $14.95.
correct.
With long tail games like this, there's always that I think push and pull between how much content justifies a price increase, or does any content justify a price increase? Because you're always going to have somebody who says, well, I was going to buy your game at $10, now that's $25, screw you, or you're
Right.
being greedy, and so on and so forth. Like, what are your thoughts on this as someone who has been working on a game for a very long time?
It's a great question. I don't think I have crisp answers. I do think $9, 8.95, whatever it's selling for was way too low
Mm-hmm.
given other indie games. I mean, forget long tail or not, other indie games of that class, were selling for about $15. So I definitely think I made a mistake. I should have priced it at $15. So in a way, raising it to 15 is kind of just making up for, past errors, regardless of the new content. The question is, I think, and this is, I think the key to your question is, as more content gets added, do I raise the price or do I just do it in expansions? And that's where I think it's a bit of a trade-off because expansions, there's no guarantee that people will buy the expansions, you know. So, but at the same time, having these expansions is kind of like, it's the gateway drug. You just buy the core game and yeah, it's only $15. Let me try it, and then you get hooked, and then now you want to buy the expansions. So it should work. So it's a trade-off. I do think the way I'm going to progress is to try to keep the core game at a reasonable kind of basically what an indie game would cost at that level, which is about $15 right now.
Mm-hmm.
$25 I think is where you're at for like the really kind of, I don't want to say high quality because we're high quality too, but for the very popular indie games with
Mm-hmm.
name brand developers, I think are at the $25
Yeah.
price point. For someone in our studio's position, it's more like it's $15. I think is a pretty standard price. I mean, you probably know way more about this than I do.
Yeah, like we've been seeing, like, again, like 4 or 5 years ago, it was like $9.99 was considered high end for any
Yep.
devs. Like today, it seems like $19.99
Yep.
is kind of like the new average. 25 is above, and then 29 is super high. And I just wonder, like going back, we were talking about No Man's Sky, that was originally priced, I think, at $60. I wonder
Yeah.
if that also led to a lot of that controversy. Because if the game was only priced at $9.99, probably nobody would have batted an eye at it.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, with No Man's Sky, it was absolutely about expectations, and
Mm-hmm.
$60 is it's setting expectations. I mean, that
Mm-hmm.
better be, that's a AAA game, right? I mean,
Oh
that
yes.
better be on par with, with Cyberpunk and anything that I can get. So, yeah, I do agree with you. I do agree with you. That said, I mean, they sold a ton of copies,
Oh yes.
so they probably did price it right.
Yeah. And
Um,
to Ishimanian's comment there, I think that may have been the person that was giving the video, the GDC talk about changing the economy and building it in the first place for the content, the sales, and whatnot.
yeah, 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 yeah. Shimanian says, yeah, Valve hired that economist specifically to look into the price line. Interesting. That's interesting.
Yeah, it's definitely a fascinating talk if you haven't seen it yet. How they
I haven't.
changed Team Fortress and make it a free to play game. And again, like it's always that challenge, like long tail design, games as a service, that kind of thing. It is high risk, high reward because the games that do it right, and why so many mobile developers chase after is that it's a money making machine. If you can keep hundreds of thousands of players entertained every month, and they're willing to spend, you know, $15 here, $30 here. You have whales who spend hundreds of dollars,
Yeah,
and you
yeah.
don't have to worry about making another video game. You don't have to worry about starting development over. You know, why not?
I agree. I mean, if you can pull it off, I mean, the dream for these kinds of long tail games, the dream obviously is that, as you're making more and more and more money, you're hiring people that will create more content, and thus, you get into this virtuous cycle where the game is improving and growing, faster and faster and faster because, you're getting more and more income. So that's kind of where I want to get to that point in the treadmill where I can actually hire people. And so now we're producing content faster, better content, higher quality content, more content.
Mm,
Um, that's I think the dream.
yeah, for sure. And I wish you the best of luck on getting to that point, George.
Thank you so much. I had a great time. Thanks a lot, and thanks to everyone listening.
Sure. And if you wouldn't mind hanging on the call for like 30 seconds, I'll have a few things to go over with you after we end things here. But do you have anything you'd like to say to the fans watching to end the cast on?
Other than thank you, I mean, thanks, especially, a lot of you guys and gals have like been with this journey for, 20 years or, whatever. So I really, really appreciate that. And I think that's a large reason why, I continue to spend a ton of time on this we have such a loyal fan base and I love it. So thank you all very much.
Awesome. So, with that, we're going to wrap things up for our cast. For those of you watching this live or recorded, thank you so much for tuning in. Do all the liking and subscribing. Be sure to check out our Discord and Patreon link down below. If you're interested in getting acknowledgement in my 5th book on design, donations of $15 or more will get that before January 10 of 2022. If you are a developer working on a game or just want to come on to talk game dev and game design with me, I'm always looking for guests. So feel free to reach out. Again, George, thank you so much for contacting me on Twitter and for coming on. And hopefully we can talk again in the future.
Great. Thank you, Josh.
Not a problem. All right. Everyone, come back for daily discussions on game design here and on game wisdom, where some of the art and science of games. And until next time, take care.